And thanks to everyone for joining us today. This is Geonetric's May webinar, still May for another day or two here, where we're going to be talking about our 2019 Healthcare Digital Marketing Trends Survey, or the results from that survey. Very excited to have everyone with us. Before we get into the data proper, wanted to walk through the survey a little bit, just have everyone understand where this stuff is coming from. I see a lot of names on this list that are new viewers and maybe people who I at least don't recognize as names who've engaged in the survey before. Want to let you know where the stuff's coming from. For those of you, and I see a number of names I recognize who have taken the survey, thank you, this year and past years, or certainly people who have engaged with the survey. Want to let you know a little bit of what has changed and what is different this year as well. So this is our 9th survey over 14 years. So it's an annual-ish survey. And this is the 3rd year we're doing it in partnership with eHealthcare Strategy and Trends. It's been a wonderful partnership. It's really allowed us to extend our reach and engage with many, many more folks from health systems around the country, get information from the systems, and of course, share the results of this out in that way as well. So a great thanks to them for their partnership in this. And that partnership has really allowed us to reach a lot of organizations. So this is the largest number of responses we've had to one of our surveys. 267 healthcare providers completed the survey, another 40 agency and vendor type organizations that work with folks in the healthcare space, and making it not just our biggest survey, but the largest survey of its kind, focused exclusively on topics in digital healthcare marketing. We do a few things differently in our survey as well. So certainly we, take a question, we analyze it, we turn it around, but very often we find the actionable information here to be at the intersection of some of these different questions and the way we put things together. Two things you see quite a lot in our survey that's a little different than the way everyone else is doing it. The first of those is we're not just giving you the results across the industry, but we segment out just about all the questions, looking at how leading organizations are differing from average organizations, are differing from organizations that are falling behind. We call those laggards. And so it's not enough to know what the industry in aggregate is doing. It's much more useful to know, hey, if I'm an average organization, how are leaders acting differently? If I'm a leading organization, what are the things that my peers are getting into that I should be aware of and be thinking about? It just makes it much easier to act on the data that's out there. The other thing that we do that's a little different is we're not just getting results from folks inside health systems. We understand there's a very close relationship these days between folks in the health system and the organizations they partner with, agencies, vendors, folks like that, to help them get things done. And so we do, well, it's a slightly different set of questions. We do also get responses from agencies and vendors. And very often when we compare the way folks inside hospitals dealing with all the day-to-day and all the things on the ground there, the way they view the world and the way that the folks who maybe aren't in that same situation but do see what many, many different health system partners are doing, how those views differ. And we can learn some things from there as well. This year we did some things differently. We've been at this for quite a while. Every year we reevaluate. This year we went back to many of you. We did a survey of people who were regular survey participants or regular survey downloaders and users to get a sense of what was most valuable, what was least valuable, what kinds of things you wanted to see in the future. And then we went one step further and engaged with a number of folks who are friends of the organization, people who are in some cases just out there speaking and very, very present, very, very visible out there, who we thought had a good viewpoint of what was going on out in the space. And we really worked with this advisory board to make sure that we were taking the survey up a couple of notches. And I'll try and point out along the way some of the things that are different for their input and some of the ways that we changed the way we were thinking about some questions and gathering some information. But their fingerprints are all over this for those of you who have seen surveys in the past and are wondering how some things are different. And so thanks to all of you, we really did put them to work on this, and I appreciate all that you guys did in order to make this happen. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the data. I've already mentioned this split that we do where we look at leading organizations and average organizations and lagging organizations. That is not a value judgment on our part. That's all self-reported data. And so we take, this year we used 20 different functional areas and we asked, hey, are you significantly ahead, somewhat ahead, about the same, somewhat behind, significantly behind your peers, your competitors in the space? And then based on their answers, we put them somewhere on the grid. So, it was sort of -2 points for significantly behind, +2 points for significantly ahead, and so on in between. And we get this distribution for the total points coming out of that. Anything 0 or below, we put them in the laggard category. Anything above 10, we call the leading organization this year. It's always kind of reassuring to see a nice bell curve out of this. It makes us feel like maybe there's some statistical validity to this beyond what the numbers tell us. But more importantly in this is one of the ways that we were told by folks that they really made use of this survey. So after you get the full report downloaded, you can go through those questions, you can score your own organization. Based on that, you can say, hey, like we're in this group or this group, and that helps you kind of position the recommendations, the information, the insights here to say, these are the things that I should be doing next, the things I should be looking at in order to move forward with things I'm doing in my organization. And this is the list of 20 functions. This is sort of the same list we use for many different kinds of questions throughout the survey. We started here with this performance question, how are you doing relative to competitors? But when we're asking about staffing, when we're asking about outsourcing, when we're asking about who owns what functions, all of those things throughout, we're using that same set of items so you can kind of track what's going on in social media across many, many different kinds of investigation that we did as part of the survey. Here we've broken out also the scoring by leaders, average, laggards. It's not a surprise, of course, that leaders score better than average score better than laggards, because this is the question around which we put everybody into those particular peer groups. So that is not the interesting thing here. The interesting things here are, well, first off, just what uh, matriculates to the top of the list here. So the things that overall organizations are feeling really good about. Well, number one, it's social media. We feel like we're doing really well in social media. General website management, digital advertising, design, and some of these get kind of close here, so we can look at accessibility and content development as well. But certainly, social media and general website management, we're feeling really good about. We can also look at the bottom of the list. Where are we as a group struggling? And at the bottom of that list, actually, overall negative scores across the board: CRM, email and marketing automation, and mobile app development. And I'll tell you, throughout a number of questions, there's just a lot of uncertainty around mobile app development. Not a good consensus for what organizations should be doing there, how they should be investing, if they should be investing, and so on and so forth. Big question marks around mobile app development. But that's one way that we look at just this overall performance thing. The other way that we like to look at is we look at the delta, right? Just because overall social media is at the top doesn't mean that that's the place where leaders are outperforming everybody else to the greatest degree. And so we look at that difference between leaders and laggards here and look at what jumps out when we start to look at that. At the top of that list this year is digital strategy. This is a bit of a shift from last year, but digital strategy is one of those levers. When you're starting to get ahead, like knowing that you've got a plan and that the things you're doing today will be built on the things that you're doing tomorrow, those kinds of things can help make you more effective. The other thing, the other way we're sort of interpreting this particular one is organizations that are leading are starting to plow new ground. And when you do that, you need to have a plan in front of you. You can't just be watching what everyone else in the space is doing and try to mimic the things that appear to be working for them. You have to sit down and find your own path forward. And so digital strategies become a bigger thing, particularly for those leading organizations. That this year nudged out what had been our top items last year, which was all about content. These are still very high on that list in terms of things that leading organizations do particularly well relative to everyone else. Content development, content marketing. And again, we said over and over again, content is the tide that lifts all ships. When you're doing content really well, so many of the other things on this list, social media, marketing automation, personalization, like these things require a constant amount of content just coming in all the time. And when you do content well, when you have a machine that can generate good content day after day, week after week, those other things become easier to execute and more effective in the process. The last item that leaders are doing particularly well is development. And again, these are things where they have that capability. Sometimes it's in-house. In this case, for many of these organizations, it is an outsourced development capability, but they have the ability to get some things done from a technical perspective as well. So with all that in mind, let's jump into redesigns. One of the areas that we see a lot of interest in every year, get a lot of comments on, is information about how organizations are redesigning. What's the cycle look like? How often are organizations changing CMSs and redesigning and doing things like that? So last year we had a bit of a break in the pattern we'd seen through the last several surveys. So, once upon a time, years and years ago, we had like a 3 to 4 year cycle time on these things. Every 3 to 4 years, if you were implementing a new site, and then you'd recently implemented a new site, and then before very long you were getting into planning the next redesign and so forth. We'd seen that stretch out to maybe more of a 5 year cycle. It was, just longer time between when we saw organizations doing those redesigns. We saw a blip a few years ago where organizations were getting onto the mobile bandwagon and doing some responsive design things. As that technology came through, we saw a lot of organizations redesigning their sites in a pretty similar time frame. Last year, we saw that cycle shrink again. We had a lot of organizations going through, doing planning, doing redesigns last year. And so this year we came into the survey really asking the question, are we going to see that shorter cycle time continue? Or did we have kind of a wave coming through and then we're going to return back to that maybe 4 to 5 year cycle that we had been seeing for a while before? And I think it's the latter rather than the former. So you see there's a lot of organizations that have recently completed a redesign, almost 30%. We have 38% that have no plans to redesign. And right now in progress, only 12% only 17% of respondents, looking in the wrong column, are in progress there. 27% in the planning stages. That puts us in a 4 to 5 year cycle kind of space, back to more or less where we had seen things before, whereas we had been seeing like a third of organizations responding to the survey that were redesigning a year ago. We also look at whether organizations are changing their content management system. And not surprisingly, usually when people are changing their content management system, they're doing that in conjunction with a redesign. Very few people are taking the site they have and just moving it over to a new platform, but you do see a little bit of that in here. But the majority of organizations that are changing platform are doing so as they're doing a redesign. That said, um, 60% of organizations that are in a redesign process are doing so without changing platforms at all. And so we do see decent amount of that changeover happening when people do redesign, but a lot of organizations are sticking with what they've got when they make those updates as well. The next thing we looked at was what features were important to the future success of their web operations. This is on a 5-point scale, so you see that there's what we actually got in terms of responses was much narrower than that when we averaged everything out. -2 for not at all important, +2 for extremely important. That zero line is neutral. So core capabilities, provider directory, conversion opportunities such as online forms, bill payment, appointment scheduling were at the top of the list from an importance perspective. At the bottom of the list, a lot of those, I guess buzzwords, the capabilities, the things that we hear a lot of talk about, but we don't necessarily see a lot of people doing much with, chatbots, mobile apps, virtual assistants. Interesting, but not really quite there for the majority of respondents to the survey at any rate. Now, we didn't look at this and we didn't want to include like sort of some of the charts get a little hard to process through a webinar. We didn't want to include all of the breakout of the leaders and laggards. And there's a lot of places where things are similar. Leaders in general found everything to be a little bit more important than everyone else. There were a couple of areas though where that was a little bigger difference. Leaders in particular were more interested in appointment scheduling, particularly appointment scheduling for current patients. They're more interested in ER and urgent care queuing. So this isn't like an online appointment. This is sort of the put my name on the list before I start driving over kind of functionality. And CRM integration as well, which maybe isn't a surprise just because we've seen CRM implementations within that leader group to be considerably higher than in the universe of hospitals and health systems in general. There were a couple of areas that we deep dove on a little bit more as well. Last year, we asked about personalization for the first time. And one of the things that we learned when we did that was personalization means a lot of different things to healthcare marketing organizations. So this year, we asked a few more questions around that, as well as just try to get a pulse of how personalization for the web is working for healthcare organizations today. When we looked at where personalization is being used right now, and this is the tan line is overall, the blue is leaders, the red is laggards here. So email is the place where personalization is getting used most often, followed by printed mailings. And then things like websites and mobile apps were quite a ways down the list. That said, 75% of respondents are using personalization somewhere within their marketing efforts. Only a quarter were not indicated they were not using personalization at all. When we asked about the methods of personalization for web personalization, that is, geography has sort of made its way to the top of that list. We'd seen a lot of use last year in sort of traffic source and campaign. Geography sort of jumped to the head of that line. Although we last year we did get some indication that it can be a challenging one for some organizations to implement and have some real success with. At the bottom of the list, using signed in personalization, where someone's actually logging into the portal and getting personalized experiences, or you've got some other method by which they're identifying themselves, as well as information provided by the CRM. And I think in many cases those things are somewhat connected. But both of those things, much less use of those kinds of methods of personalization for the web today. Now, one of the questions we asked last year and got kind of a shocking response, we reframed a little bit, but asked again this year. We don't do a lot where we're pulling last year's numbers and comparing side by side, but the shift from last year to this year was so big that we thought we had to, sort of put those things down on paper next to each other. We asked how much do you agree with the statement? Our organization can demonstrate that website personalization has improved the performance of our digital marketing, right? Seems pretty critical. The amount of interest, the amount of investment going on in personalization, is it making you better at doing the things you do? And last year, the answer was largely no, right? We had a quarter of respondents strongly disagree, a third of respondents disagreed in some fashion. And again, we reframed the question, but a third of folks last year said, I'm not sure. The I'm not sure question got a little bit funny. It was hard to tell, like when people don't answer the question, are they also unsure, whatever. So we reframed the question a little bit, but last year it was pretty clear there's at least a contingent of people who were feeling pretty bad about the investment they were making up to that point. We look at things this year, and while there's not a resounding yes, there's not like a huge, portion of folks saying strongly agree. It's only 2%. 43% of respondents agreed that yes, personalization was making their digital marketing better, and 43% were neutral. So much smaller number of people who are in the active disagreement category, much stronger cohort of folks saying yes, it is, although it is not knocking things out of the park just yet. And I think what we're seeing here is personalization's hard. Otherwise, we'd all be doing it. If it was just a switch we could flip, we would have all done that by now. Understanding the use cases that actually work in healthcare as opposed to all these other industries that have been doing this a little bit longer, but add value for us in healthcare has been a bit of a process. And so those organizations that are getting in, that are putting in the time, that are putting in the resources, are starting to find success with personalization, but it does appear to take some time to get there. Another area where we jumped in a little deeper was business listings. This is something that's really sort of hit the front burner for a lot of organizations in the last few years. We wanted to start to get a sense of how organizations were going about tackling this and how happy they were with the way that they were approaching this. So We asked how organizations are managing their business listings online. For a lot of organizations, that is a manual thing that they're doing. So in like order 45% of respondents, that's the way they're going about doing that. The next largest chunk is outsourcing that to a vendor of some sort. Smaller groups then either not managing listings or doing it through a tool that they've licensed but are using themselves. And many of those groups that are actually using the self-administered tools tend to be larger organizations with larger staffs. So they actually have the people to go and utilize the tool themselves there as well. Now, in that process, we also asked a bit about how happy they were with their business listing management today. Again, not surprising, leaders are happier than average or happier than laggards. They're doing more, so on and so forth. I guess if I go back for a moment, you can see that leaders are most likely to be outsourcing that to a vendor, also most likely to be using a self-administered tool, least likely to be trying to tackle this manually themselves. So maybe not a surprise there that leaders are happier than everyone else. Laggards are sort of the actively unhappy group, and that's, they are most likely to be doing this stuff by hand. And when we look at the second chart here, manually doing this is just a sea of unhappiness for folks. People are much less happy managing this manually than if they just ignored it and didn't manage it at all. The folks that are outsourcing, the folks who are using a self-administer online tool, both of those groups pretty happy with where they're at with these things. So probably worth some level of investment there. We also asked quite a bit about goals, and not necessarily specifically goals of a redesign, but goals for digital marketing success. We actually framed the question, what's most important for the future success of your digital marketing? And we couldn't have broken this out into cleaner groupings if we'd tried. So at the top here, we have a group that is consumers and patients. Consumer experience, engagement, patient recruitment, patient satisfaction, consumer awareness. I will say that it is very reassuring to see that the consumer experience, basically the value that we're adding to consumers and patients has become more important than just awareness to those consumers and patients. That has been something, although we've asked the question slightly different ways, that's shifted some over the years. Awareness still pretty important, but less important than the value we're delivering to consumers. And I think that's the way that it probably should be for the things we do in digital. But that's our top grouping. And all of the consumer and patient items are in that grouping. The next group, which includes all of our financial metrics, return on investment, revenue, profitability, falls squarely in the middle. Not far behind that consumer and patient grouping, but clearly the next step down from there. We have a bigger drop off to this last group, which is essentially all of the other audiences. Community relations, physician engagement, employee recruitment, fundraising, all fall pretty significantly below those other two groups. So this is the importance. How important do you think this is? We also ask, how able are you to demonstrate success in this area? Basically, can you measure, do you report on metrics around this area? And we get a slightly different picture. Now, in the final report, we've got all of the tables and all that stuff in there. But this, I think, is more telling for the time that we have together today. Those financial metrics are the areas that have the biggest gap. So not quite in the top set of most important, not that far behind though, in terms of importance. In terms of our ability to demonstrate, far, far down the list there. ROI being the biggest gap of that whole mix. So yes, ROI is moderately important, but for many, many organizations, our ability to actually report on that metric is still out of reach. By chance, we elected to dig deeper on ROI. It's one that we continue to hear a lot about all the time as we engage with the market. We wanted to really learn where folks are from this perspective. And of course, we made these calls before we saw the data, so it's kind of a neat thing that it's a challenge and we have some deeper data to look at that. So we asked those organizations that said basically, no, we can't report ROI, we don't report ROI. And we said, why not? What is getting in the way of you doing that? And the number one item by a large margin was we just don't have the tools in place, the technical infrastructure to be able to deliver this information in a reasonable way. And if you're trying to add these up to 100, obviously this is one where people could pick multiple answers. So this one really outpaced everything else and outpaced it by a wide margin. Kind of surprising to us just because we've seen so much adoption of CRM systems in the past several years. One of the key value propositions of those systems being that it can deliver the connection between your marketing efforts and the financial impact of those for many, many kinds of marketing campaigns. Still a challenge for a great many organizations out there, though. Some of the other items that we saw on the list also sort of fall into a similar kind of category. Need an easier way, too time consuming. Tools and infrastructure probably help to solve some of those problems. But more interesting to me was the number two item on this list. No formal justification required. Essentially, number one is we don't have the tools to do it, and number two is we don't bother because no one's asking us for it. And almost a third of organizations that said that they're not reporting listed this as one of the reasons they weren't reporting today. So, for all the discussion of this, there's still a large number of organizations where nobody is feeling very accountable to their ability to deliver on these kinds of financial metrics. Let's look next at budgets. So, the uh, the numbers, the budget dollars, we watch in two different groupings here. So we ask about the overall marketing budget. I know not every dollar coming into digital is coming from marketing, but we do continue to see a very, very high correlation in there. We also asked for the expected change in the digital marketing budget. Looking at the overall marketing budget, a little more than half, 54%, saying they're going to remain the same. A little more than a third increasing, the remainder decreasing their overall marketing budget. We look at digital in contrast, and nearly 2/3 of digital budgets are growing. About 30%, 31% remaining the same, and only just over 5% are decreasing. So and this is one of a number of indications we'll see here. Dollars are shifting from traditional to digital. It's part of what's going on. It's continuing to move that direction. I will say last year, even with 11% of budgets, overall marketing budgets, I'm sorry, even with the percentage last year of digital marketing budgets that were decreasing, only a small portion of those were decreasing because they through normal decreasing. Like most of those were organizations that were in the midst of very large projects. They would have very large teams. They'd have very large budgets. Those were additional investment that was never anticipated to remain on past launching whatever that next big initiative is. And so they were looking for their budget the next year to decrease. We see a mix this year. Some of those appear to be that category. Some of those just appear to be organizations where budgets are tightening and digital is taking a hit in that mix as well. We do bring these things together and compare. So across the top, we have overall marketing budget decreasing, remaining the same, increasing. And then down in the rows, we've got change in the digital marketing budget. And as you can see, yes, when overall marketing budgets decreased, this year we had 45% of digital marketing budgets decreasing as well. We're seeing more of that this year. Last year, that was a very, very small number. But I will point your attention to these situations where overall marketing budgets are decreasing. 41, 42% of digital budgets are remaining the same, 12.5% are increasing. When overall marketing budgets are staying the same, 42% are remaining the same, 57% are increasing. So again, more indication that we're seeing more and more of those dollars shifting from traditional to digital through this mix. And again, from last year to this year, though, we are seeing less uptick in digital when the overall budgets are tight. Last year, I think when we saw overall marketing budgets decreasing, we still saw upwards of 40% of digital budgets increasing anyway. We're certainly not seeing it at that level this year. One of the big changes that we got from our advisory group, one of the areas we really explored, is how do we look at financials? How do we look at staffing? And it was an area where we got a lot of feedback. It's become more and more difficult to answer some of the questions the way that we were asking them in the past. We were asking, just to give us a number, what is your, digital marketing budget? And the answer was sort of, well, what do you include in that? It's really hard for us to know. This is a budget that's really distributed throughout, primarily our marketing budgets. Occasionally there's some pieces other places, but primarily the marketing budget. It's not broken out that cleanly. And so what we got instead was, hey, it would be probably easier for me to answer and more accurate if you just asked what portion of our marketing budget was dedicated to digital. I can give you at least a pretty good rough feeling for what that number looks like. So that's how we asked this information this year. And you can see how it breaks out by laggard, average, and leader as well. So the most common grouping here is 20 to 40% of marketing budgets going to digital. That's the overall, as you can see from those couple of groupings there. In general, leaders spending a little bit more than average, spending a little bit more than laggard. There are some other patterns that we see emerging here, and particularly I'll point you towards the laggard grouping. We have a significant all or nothing going on within the laggard group. Both of these tend to be much smaller budget numbers. But with tighter budgets, it's harder for organizations to say, yeah, I'm going to have a split between these two things. Instead, they say, you know what, we're just going to do the bare minimum for digital, and we're going to use what little resources we have and do this kind of marketing over here. Or you know what, we just don't have money to do the traditional marketing things. We're going to be effectively all in on digital. Not a strategy that I think we recommend. Obviously, they're in the laggard category for the most part, so not necessarily a strategy that seems to be yielding a ton of success for them. But we do see for those very lean organizations that there is some all or nothing that goes on within those groups there. We also asked lots and lots of questions about team size and organizational structure. And again, there's a lot more data in the final report. But we changed the way that we approach this year. So last year we just said, how many people are in your core digital marketing team? And again, the survey and our advisory board in particular sat us down and said, you know what, like I don't even know who to include in that anymore. What would be better for us is if you gave us a list of different functional areas, and I can tell you how many FTEs we have doing SEO or doing, digital advertising or dealing with hosting or doing some of these other things. So that's what we did. Again, that same set of 20 functions that we've been talking about all along, we asked how many FTEs for each of those 20 functions. And the answers we got, maybe not surprisingly, were dramatically bigger than those core team sizes that we've been asking about the past couple of cycles. So the information is difficult to compare year to year, but we feel like this is much more representative of the actual effort going into the development, the care and feeding of digital marketing operations within health systems. Like last year, we looked at means and medians. We used to just report means. There are some groups with very large teams that tend to skew the numbers up. So we started including some median numbers as well. That said, overall, total, FTEs going towards digital efforts, we see almost 21 people as a mean, 14 people as a median. So there's a lot of effort being put into all these digital operations at these health systems. Leaders, that's 24 and a half and 20. They're bigger team sizes. But again, as digital is not something done by those folks over there anymore, but becomes part of what everyone within the marketing operation, as well as some people in IT and in PR and communications and some of these other functional areas, we're really seeing this shift to to bigger teams, but teams that are doing a lot of things where digital is part of what they do on a day-to-day basis. We also asked some different questions around are we using mostly generalists, mostly specialists? And this is sort of to indulge a hypothesis that we've been kicking around for the last couple of years. All these areas are getting so much more specialized, and it's becoming difficult for this sort of old generalist webmaster model to really be truly effective with SEO and PPC and maybe doing some things with the servers and content development and all these different areas. So many of these areas are specialized, but we really wanted to see how is the staffing breaking out? Are people using a lot of these generalists? Are organizations using a huge number of specialists, and have they really focused that way? In the breakout, you can see here smaller numbers for things like, where we're using mostly generalists. For the most part, it's either a mix or it's more skewed towards specialists. Leaders are using more specialists than everyone else. They're also, though, using a larger mix group than everyone else. They just tend to not be in the mostly or primarily generalist category. So let's explore this a little bit more. Because we looked at that and then we said, well, like, do you have a larger team when you go one approach or another? And I think what we kind of came to the conclusion of is we have correlation, but maybe we had the causation backwards. So it's not that using primarily specialists yields a bigger team, but much more likely when you have very few people, you need them to be generalists. So it's not that primarily generalists gives you smaller teams. It's like, you can't really specialize that much if your team is 3 people. So as teams get bigger, you start using more and more specialists in that mix. When you hit a certain size, you kind of shift over to, hey, we're going to be mostly specialists here. And then when teams get beyond some additional threshold, which may be, 20 people or so, hey, suddenly we don't need more and more specialists in, say, SEO. We've got 1 or 2 specialists in that area. We've got 1 or 2 digital advertising specialists. We have, some people who are deep in a number of these different areas. Now we can backfill with some generalists who can add capacity in a number of different areas. They're not, as deep in any one of them, but it gives us greater flexibility, and they can do things with the support of these deeper specialists. So the largest teams tend to use more of that mixed hybrid model. So this is how the staffing breaks out by laggard, average, leader, and kind of the team size. Team sizes here, we're cutting things a little bit differently. So while the numbers are close, they do vary a little bit from sort of our totals from before. But certainly we see a lot of staffing in areas of content, in areas of general website management. We tend to see very little staffing being applied in areas like mobile app development and web hosting, very little staffing going to, web accessibility and business listing management as well. This leads us to a place where we start to think about growth. And we did ask some questions about where the areas are going to grow. Last year, we asked specifically about staffing growth. We wanted to keep it a little broader. Again, some of the feedback we got is it's, whether we're adding a staff person or committing part of a staff person to something versus going outside to get that talent, that's a very fluid decision. And so we just wanted to look at what are the areas where you're looking to grow capacity. Obviously, growth and capacity is happening in a lot of different places up and down the line. But when we look at things at the top here, and this is ordered, by the way, by net growth, so the red minus the blue, so which is why you see occasionally things that seem a little bit out of order there. But digital advertising, top growth area, digital strategy, a bit behind that, and then areas like video production, content marketing, content development, and CRM, all getting quite a lot of that additional development as well. We've particularly, and we just actually published an article, you can find it on the geonetric.com LinkedIn page, some things like that. Looked at where are some of the places where the growth here is maybe outpacing what we might expect, called those booming spaces. Our booming spaces here were digital advertising and content development. These are areas where health systems are generally doing very well. The vendors think they're doing pretty well. There's a fair amount of staff being put into those things anyway as well. And yet we're hiring a lot of staff in those areas anyway. Right, those are areas where we're not backfilling because we don't have people. It's not we're trying to make up for the fact that we're behind. We're doing really well there, and we're doubling down in those areas. And so those were 2 of the areas that we particularly identified as growth areas that sort of where that growth is sort of above and beyond, sort of trying to correct for issues that we had. I will say patterns of growth between the leaders and laggards was fairly similar, a couple notable exceptions. Leaders are more aggressively growing capabilities for CRM and analytics, and then laggards, in contrast, are investing more aggressively in more core functions, digital strategy, project management, some areas like that. All right, couple of thoughts before we go into questions. As was mentioned before, the report here is very nearly done. We had some hard copies that we took out to the conference last week. We're making some tweaks to it and finalizing a couple things for the production digital copy of that. You can sign up for that at geonetric.com/waitlist. If you participated in the survey and completed it, you'll get a copy anyway. But if you're not sure, you don't remember, or if you're just watching the webinar anyway, you can certainly get your name on that list, and we'll make sure that you get that here shortly. When you get that report, um, the ways that we heard from people who have used it in the past where they were getting the most value. First off, go through score yourself, right? Go through those 20 functional areas. You're significantly behind, you're somewhat behind, you're significantly ahead, you're somewhat ahead. um, Score yourself out, see where you fall, and then go through the whole report with that in mind. And we saw a lot of organizations just indicated that this information was really, really important for them when they were doing their planning to try and identify how to really invest in areas that other organizations were having success in, looking at areas to invest in or to increase their investment in order to be more competitive in the future. Again, for some leaders out there, they said it was really useful to them to see what other leaders are doing because they all feel like they're plowing new fields and getting an idea of where other people are approaching some of those investments and finding some opportunities was really insightful to them as they did their own planning for that. And then the other thing that we heard again and again was having some of this benchmark data was really critically important for organizations as they were competing for a limited set of resources, whether that's within the marketing budget or going out and looking for resources from the organization through some other channel. Having some information to point to say, hey, this is how other folks like us are doing this, and in particular, if we want to lead here, the investment we need to make needs to start to change. And we've been happy to hear that organizations have had some real success in doing some of those things. So with that, we do have some time for questions.
Awesome. While we give, excuse me, while we give Ben a minute to kind of read through some of the questions that you sent in, just a quick reminder, if you do have questions that maybe you haven't typed in yet, you can do that within the GoToWebinar platform itself, but we'll kind of get started here. First one comes from Patrick, and he is wondering what is meant by personalization in online advertising?
So it's a good question. I think there's a number of different ways that advertising gets personalized. Some of this may just be a question of targeting or of making sure that you're putting messaging in front of the right person. But we are seeing more and more scenarios where even with the same campaign, based on preferences, based on gender, based on other things that we can target on, that different creative, different messaging is used to appeal to audiences out there, and that organizations are actually splitting their campaigns in order to make the messages more relevant to a particular group or a particular set of individuals.
Right, and then we had someone asking about the number of hospitals or healthcare systems that participated in the survey, and I believe I got some confirmation that was 267. So of the 307 total responses, we had 267 that came from hospitals and or healthcare systems. But then a follow-up question to that was about how many are rural. And Ben, I don't know if you can remember right off the top of your head, or you kind of have a ballpark estimate there.
So we didn't look specifically at rural versus urban. This is one of the things that we've explored a bit. How do we kind of match some things up in order to make this as relevant as possible? The reality is that we've sort of moved away from some of those designations because so many of the people responding are responding for systems that have many, many different moving pieces, and in many cases they may have some health some sites that are more rural, some sites that are more suburban, some sites that are more urban, and it's really difficult for them to actually pick one of those designations. We did do some things where we're doing some slices of data around some different kinds of groupings. And so we're doing some cutting of the data around academic medical centers, for instance. And even there, because so many academic medical centers are part of systems with many, many moving pieces, it becomes difficult to create a clean peer group within there that's not doing a number of different things all together. So unfortunately, like as systems get bigger, and we do see the average organization size responding to these things getting bigger every year, it's becoming more and more difficult to sort of split the urban and rural thing in a way that really makes sense without making it harder for people to respond. The survey is long. We try to make sure that the questions are as straightforward as they can be, that people don't have to go off digging for information in order to respond to these things and those kinds of things. I think we had something like 700 people start the survey, and we ended up with a little over 300 total responses, about 307 total responses. So we do lose a lot of people along the way, and so we try to be careful not to make it more confusing for folks, which leads to more drop off.
All right, thanks, Ben. That was a great, good question. I have another one here. Someone's wondering what you're hearing around expectation to report on ROI once an organization has implemented CRM. You just got back from a couple trade shows. Have you heard what's the buzz around the industry?
I think what we see is a lot of different organizational personalities, and we've seen some that have moved down a road where they're trying to build and support business cases around more and more of the things they're investing in, and trying to make sure that many of those investments have a return, or if they don't, they understand why they're doing it, and they're making sure that those things are being done intentionally rather than for lack of going through and doing that. I do think that for a lot of organizations, there is an expectation to report on some of those financial metrics. Um, at the same time, I think even if you're not getting that pressure today, the day that someone walks in and asks you to justify the investment you're making is a bad time to start trying to figure out how you're going to report that information. So um, I'm not sure if this is answering quite the question you're asking. We really do encourage organizations to be looking at building financial cases around the investments that they're making. Um, ROI is one way to do that. Other financial metrics can be reported on as well. But I do think that many organizations go into CRM implementations with the expectation that that's going to help their ability to deliver on that kind of information. Um, and it seems like some of them are still struggling to get there.
All right, looks like unless anybody had any additional questions that I missed, it looks like we kind of covered everything. So thanks everybody for attending today, and we will see you next month.